My 8-year-old daughter was unconscious on the floor, and my wife was standing beside her without a single tear in her eyes. When I asked what happened, she calmly said, she needed to learn a lesson. Immediately felt something cold move through my chest. I had come home 2 hours earlier than expected that afternoon, and the moment I pushed my front door open with my right hand, I knew something was wrong. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I am 69 years old. I stepped inside, placed my suitcase carefully beside the wall with my left hand, and pulled the door shut behind me. I took one step forward with my right foot, then another with my left. Usually, Lily would hear the door and come running toward me shouting, "Daddy!" But that afternoon there was nothing. No footsteps. No laughter. Just silence. I slowly turned my head toward the living room and called, "Lily?" There was no answer. I took another step, then another, and when I reached the edge of the hallway, I saw a small figure lying near the living room doorway. My heart stopped. I moved toward her quickly, dropped to my knees, and placed my right hand beside her shoulder. "Lily?" I whispered. I gently touched her cheek, then shook her shoulder once. She did not move. I put 2 fingers near her nose and mouth, desperately checking for breathing. She was breathing, but she would not open her eyes. I turned my head toward the kitchen and shouted, "Claire!" A few seconds later, my wife walked out. I expected her to run toward our daughter. Instead, she stopped several feet away and simply looked at Lily. I pushed myself up from the floor and stepped toward her. "What happened to our daughter?" I demanded. Claire folded her arms and calmly said, "She was misbehaving, so I disciplined her." I stared at her, unable to understand how she could sound so calm while our little girl was unconscious behind me. I pulled my phone from my pocket with shaking fingers and called emergency services. While waiting, I returned to Lily, knelt beside her again, and held her tiny hand in mine. Before I continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from. Minutes later, the paramedics rushed through the front door. One dropped beside Lily and began checking her, while another asked me what had happened. I explained that I had just arrived home and found her unconscious. Then one paramedic slowly stood up, looked directly at Claire, and his entire expression changed. He turned toward me and lowered his voice. "Sir, is that your wife?" I nodded. He looked at Claire again and whispered, "Because actually, we have been called to this house before." The paramedic's words made my stomach drop. I turned my head slowly toward Claire, then back toward him. "What do you mean you have been called here before?" I asked. He looked at the other paramedic, and the two exchanged a quick glance. Then he crouched beside me and lowered his voice. "Sir, we have responded to this address twice in the past 6 months. I felt my fingers tighten around Lily's hand. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated before saying, "Both times, the call involved your daughter." My heart started pounding. I looked down at Lily, then slowly raised my eyes toward Claire. She was standing near the kitchen entrance, completely silent. "What happened those other times?" I asked. The paramedic told me that the previous calls involved Lily complaining of dizziness, weakness, and unexplained injuries. According to their records, Claire had told them Lily was simply clumsy and had fallen. I looked at my wife in disbelief. I had been away for work several times during those months, and Claire had always told me Lily was fine. I had believed her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumb trembled as I unlocked the screen and opened the family photographs. I showed the paramedic a picture of Lily taken 3 weeks earlier. She had been smiling, holding a small stuffed rabbit with no visible injuries. The paramedic looked at the photograph, then at Lily lying on the floor. His expression became even more serious. "Sir, something does not add up." The ambulance team carefully lifted Lily onto the stretcher. I stood up and took one step toward my wife. "Claire, what have you been telling these people?" I asked. She immediately said, "Nothing. They are misunderstanding everything." I took another step closer. "Then why did you never tell me they had been here before?" Claire opened her mouth but said nothing. The paramedic interrupted us and told me I needed to ride with Lily to the hospital. I turned toward my daughter, reached down, and gently touched her forehead with my right hand. "Daddy is coming with you," I whispered. As I followed the stretcher toward the front door, I heard Claire say behind me, "Daniel." "Wait." I stopped and slowly turned around. She was looking at me with a fear I had never seen in her eyes before. Then she whispered, "Do not let them ask Lily what happened." Claire's words stopped me in the doorway. Do not let them ask Lily what happened. I slowly turned my head toward her, trying to understand why a mother would be afraid of her own daughter speaking to doctors. My right hand was still resting on the edge of the front door, and for a moment I could not move. Then I stepped backward once and asked why. Claire immediately shook her head. Daniel, she is confused. She does not know what she is saying. I looked toward Lily, lying motionless on the stretcher. I walked over to her, placed my left hand gently against the side of her head and whispered, "Daddy is here." One of the paramedics pushed the stretcher toward the ambulance, and I followed beside him. I climbed the first step into the ambulance, placed my right foot inside, then lifted my left foot and sat beside Lily. Before the doors closed, I looked back at Claire. She was standing completely still in the doorway watching us leave. There was something in her expression that frightened me more than her earlier calmness. It looked like fear. The ambulance started moving, and I held Lily's hand the entire way to the hospital. I kept asking the paramedic if she would be okay, but he could not give me a definite answer. When we arrived, the doors opened and the medical team rushed Lily inside. I jumped down from the ambulance, nearly stumbling as my feet touched the pavement, and hurried after them. A nurse stopped me near the emergency room entrance and asked me to wait outside. I sat in a plastic chair, leaned forward, and pressed both hands against my face. I kept replaying Claire's words in my mind. Do not let them ask Lily what happened. About 20 minutes later, the same paramedic came over and sat beside me. He looked directly into my eyes and said, "Daniel, I need to tell you something." I lowered my hands and waited. He explained that Lily's condition did not look like a simple accident or ordinary discipline. There were signs that made the doctors concerned about repeated trauma. My heart sank. I asked him what he meant by repeated trauma. He paused and said, "We need to speak to your daughter when she wakes up." Then his phone suddenly rang. He answered, listened for several seconds, and looked at me with a worried expression. After ending the call, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Daniel, your wife just called the hospital and asked us not to let Lily speak to anyone." The paramedic's words left me frozen in that hospital chair. I slowly lowered my hands from my face and looked at him. "She called here?" I asked. He nodded. I stood up, pushed the chair backward with my leg, and took a slow step toward the emergency room doors. "Why would my wife call a hospital and ask them not to speak to our daughter?" I asked. The paramedic did not answer immediately. He looked around the hallway first, then motioned for me to follow him toward a quieter corner. I walked beside him, my right hand clenched tightly around my phone. He told me that Claire had claimed Lily had a history of emotional problems and that anything Lily said about the family should not be taken seriously. I felt my jaw tighten. I had never heard my wife say anything like that about our daughter. Lily was a happy child. She loved drawing, reading, and asking me 100 questions whenever I came home from work. She had never been diagnosed with any emotional problem. I pulled out my phone and opened an old video I had recorded of Lily just 2 weeks earlier. In it, she was sitting beside me at the kitchen table, laughing while she tried to teach me a new card game. I showed it to the paramedic. He watched the entire clip without saying a word. Then he looked at me and said, "That does not look like a child with the problems your wife described." Before I could respond, a nurse hurried toward us. She told me that Lily had started to regain consciousness. I immediately followed her toward the room. When I reached the doorway, I stopped and took a deep breath before stepping inside. Lily's eyes were barely open. I walked to her bedside, pulled the chair closer, and sat down. I gently wrapped my right hand around hers. "Sweetheart, Daddy is here," I whispered. Her fingers moved slightly. I leaned closer. "Can you hear me?" Lily slowly opened her eyes. She looked at me for a few seconds, and then tears rolled down her cheeks. I asked her what had happened. She tried to speak, but no words came out. I told her she was safe and that she could tell me anything. Then she looked toward the door, lowered her voice, and whispered, "Daddy, Mommy told me if I ever told you the truth, she would make you disappear too." Her words made every part of my body go still. I leaned closer to the bed and gently squeezed Lily's hand. "What do you mean Mommy would make Daddy disappear?" I asked. Lily's lower lip trembled and she looked toward the hospital door again. I immediately understood that she was afraid someone might hear us. I pulled my chair closer, placed my left hand on the edge of the bed, and whispered, "You are safe here." Nobody is going to hurt you. Lily took a shaky breath and finally began telling me what had been happening while I was away. She said Claire had started getting angry with her several months earlier. At first, it was small things. Claire would lock her in her bedroom for hours, take away her food as punishment, and tell her that nobody would believe her if she complained. I felt my chest tighten as Lily continued. She told me that Claire had also warned her never to tell me what happened at home because, according to her, Daddy was too stressed and might leave forever if he knew. I asked Lily why she had never called me. She started crying and said Claire had taken away her phone and told her that if she tried to contact me, something terrible would happen. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to control my anger. Then I asked the question I was almost afraid to hear the answer to. Lily, did Mommy hurt you today? She nodded slowly. She was angry because I broke a glass, she whispered. She grabbed my arm and pushed me. I looked down at her wrist and noticed dark marks I had not seen before. I carefully moved her sleeve upward with 2 fingers. There were bruises along her arm. My stomach turned. I stood up, walked to the doorway, and asked the nurse to come inside. When she saw the marks, her expression immediately changed. She called another nurse and quietly asked them to document everything. Then the doctor arrived and examined Lily. I stepped back toward the wall, folding my arms tightly across my chest. I wanted to scream, but I knew Lily needed me to stay calm. Then the doctor looked at me and said something that made my heart sink. Daniel, these bruises are not from one incident. Your daughter may have been hurt repeatedly. The doctor's words made my hands go cold. I slowly turned toward Lily, then looked back at him. Repeatedly, I asked. The doctor nodded and explained that the bruises on her arms were at different stages of healing. That meant they had not all happened on the same day. I walked back to Lily's bedside, pulled the chair closer with my right hand and sat down. I gently placed my hand over hers. Lily, I need you to tell me everything you remember. You are not in trouble. She nodded, but her eyes immediately filled with tears. She told me that Claire had been hurting her whenever I was away for work. Sometimes she would grab her arms. Sometimes she would push her into a chair. And sometimes she would lock her in her room and tell her that Daddy would be angry if he ever found out. I felt tears forming in my own eyes. I had spent months believing my daughter was simply becoming quieter because she was growing up. I had no idea she had been silently begging for help. I asked Lily why she had never told me when I called. She looked down at the blanket and whispered, Mommy always stood beside me when you called. Then, she said something that made my heart break. She told me that if I told you, she would hurt you too. I took a slow breath and told Lily that none of this was her fault. The doctor asked me to step outside while the nurses continued examining her. I walked into the hallway, closed the door behind me, and leaned my back against the wall. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at Claire's name. My thumb hovered over the call button. I wanted to demand answers, but something stopped me. If Claire knew Lily had spoken, she might try to destroy evidence or change her story. Just then, a hospital social worker approached me. She introduced herself and said she had reviewed Lily's medical records. Then she quietly asked me, Daniel, has your daughter ever mentioned a woman named Melissa? I frowned. No, why? The social worker looked at me seriously. Because Melissa has reported concerns about your daughter before, and your wife told her to stay out of your family's life. The name Melissa caught me completely off guard. I slowly straightened my back against the hallway wall and asked the social worker, Who is Melissa? She told me Melissa was a neighbor who lived 2 houses away from us. According to her records, Melissa had contacted Child Services months earlier because she had heard Lily crying late at night. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I had never heard anything about it. I asked why nobody had contacted me. The social worker explained that Claire had told them that Melissa was confused and had a personal grudge against our family. I lowered my eyes and stared at the hospital floor. Then I remembered something. A few months earlier, Claire had casually told me that our neighbor had become strange and that I should stop talking to her. I had trusted my wife and never questioned it. The social worker handed me a printed report. I took it with both hands and read Melissa's statement. She had described hearing Lily crying and begging someone to stop. She had even written down the date and approximate time. I looked at the date and felt my heart sink. I had been away on a business trip that exact week. I asked if Melissa was still available. The social worker nodded and said she had been waiting to speak with someone who would actually listen. I immediately asked for her contact information. Before I could call, my phone vibrated. It was Claire. I stared at her name on the screen for several seconds. Then I answered. "Where are you?" she asked. Her voice sounded unusually calm. I told her I was at the hospital with Lily. There was a long silence. Then Claire asked, "Did she tell you anything?" I felt every muscle in my body tense. I asked what she meant. Claire quickly changed her tone and said she was only worried about Lily, but before she ended the call, she whispered something that made me realize she knew more than she was admitting. "Daniel, you need to bring Lily home before someone makes this worse." I ended the call and looked at the social worker. She was watching me carefully. Then she said, "Daniel, do not take your daughter home with her." I looked at the social worker and slowly shook my head. "I am not taking my daughter back there," I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. I turned toward Lily's room, placed my right hand on the door handle and gently pushed it open. She was awake now, staring at the ceiling. When she saw me, she immediately reached out her small hand. I walked to her bedside, pulled the chair closer, and sat beside her. "You are staying with Daddy," I whispered. Lily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the hallway. I asked if she was afraid of someone. She hesitated, then whispered, "Mommy will be angry." I told her that nobody was going to take her away from me. A few minutes later, the doctor returned and told me Lily needed to remain under observation. I thanked him and stepped back into the hallway. The social worker was waiting with Melissa's phone number. I called her immediately. A woman answered after the second ring. When I introduced myself, there was a long silence. Then Melissa said, "Daniel, I have been trying to tell you for months." I asked her what she had seen. She told me that whenever I was away, Claire would sometimes take Lily outside late at night. Melissa had seen Claire dragging Lily by the arm toward the garage. She had also heard Lily crying and begging her mother to stop. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers against my forehead. "Why did you not tell me directly?" I asked. Melissa said she had tried. Claire had warned her that if she interfered again, she would be accused of harassment. Then Melissa said something that made me sit down in the nearest chair. She told me she had once seen Claire carrying a small locked box from the garage into the house. She did not know what was inside, but she remembered Claire saying on the phone, "He can never find this." I immediately thought about the garage. There was a small storage cabinet I had never been allowed to open. I told Melissa I needed to know what was inside that box. She replied, "Daniel, I already know where Claire keeps the key." Then she gave me an address. It was not our house. It was a storage unit registered under my name. The storage unit was registered under my name, yet I had never heard of it. I stood in the hospital hallway, staring at Melissa's number on my phone, trying to understand why my wife would keep a secret storage unit connected to me. I called Melissa again and asked her how she knew about it. She told me that several months earlier, she had seen Claire leaving the facility with the same small locked box she had noticed in our garage. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I walked to the hospital reception desk and asked whether there was a quiet room where I could make an important call. Once inside, I sat down, placed my phone on the table, and contacted my attorney. I explained everything, from the moment I found Lily unconscious to the information about the storage unit. My attorney told me not to go there alone. He said we needed to involve the authorities because the unit could contain evidence related to Lily's injuries. I agreed. A few hours later, an investigator met me outside the hospital. We drove together to the storage facility. I stepped out of the car, closed the door behind me, and looked at the long row of metal doors. The investigator checked the records and confirmed that the unit was legally registered in my name. We reached the correct door, and I slowly placed my hand on the lock. It opened with a loud metallic click. I lifted the door, and the smell of dust and old cardboard immediately filled the air. Inside were several boxes, an old suitcase, and a small wooden cabinet. The investigator walked in first. I followed behind him, carefully stepping over a stack of papers. Then I noticed the small locked box Melissa had described. It was sitting on a shelf at eye level. The investigator opened it with a key found inside one of the nearby boxes. Inside were photographs, medical papers, and several handwritten notes. I picked up the first photograph with trembling fingers. It showed Lily sitting alone in a chair looking frightened. I turned it over. A date was written on the back. It was from a day when Claire had told me Lily was visiting a friend. Then I found another photograph. And another. My hands began shaking as I realized these were not random pictures. Someone had been documenting what was happening to my daughter for months. Then the investigator pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed the power button. A woman's voice suddenly filled the storage unit. It was Claire's voice, and the first words she said were, "If Daniel ever finds out, everything is over." The moment I heard Claire's voice coming from the recorder, I felt the air leave my lungs. I slowly lowered the photograph in my right hand and looked at the investigator, but neither of us spoke. The recording continued, and Claire was talking to someone I could not identify. Her voice sounded cold and completely different from the woman I had known for decades. She said, "Daniel cannot know what happened. If he finds out, he will take Lily away from me." I pressed my lips together and listened carefully as the other person asked why she had continued hurting Lily when she knew the child was becoming weaker. Claire answered, "Because she talks too much. She keeps asking questions." My stomach turned. I placed the photograph back on the shelf and stepped closer to the recorder. The investigator raised one hand, signaling me not to touch anything. Then Claire said something that made my knees feel weak. "The girl already knows about the first incident." I looked at the investigator and quietly asked, "What first incident?" He immediately wrote the words down while the recording continued. Claire admitted that Lily had discovered something months earlier and had threatened to tell me. Instead of explaining what Lily had seen, Claire said she had frightened her into silence. Then the recording suddenly stopped. The investigator carefully removed the recorder and placed it inside an evidence bag. He told me that this could become a major piece of evidence, but we needed to understand exactly what Claire meant by the first incident. I immediately thought about Lily. We returned to the hospital, and I walked straight toward her room. I pushed the door open slowly with my right hand and stepped inside. Lily was awake, sitting against the pillows. When she saw me, she reached for my hand. I walked to her bedside, pulled the chair closer with my left hand, and gently wrapped my fingers around hers. "Sweetheart," I whispered, "there is something I need to ask you." Lily looked at me nervously. I told her she was safe and that she could tell me anything. Then I asked, "What did you see that Mommy did not want me to know?" Lily stared at the blanket for several seconds. Her fingers tightened around mine, and a tear slowly rolled down her cheek. Then she looked up at me and whispered, "Daddy, I saw Mommy put something in your food." Lily's words made my entire body go numb. I kept holding her hand, but for several seconds I could not even speak. I leaned closer to her and whispered, "What did Mommy put in Daddy's food?" Lily looked toward the hospital door, then back at me. I gently placed my left hand on her shoulder and told her she did not have to be afraid anymore. She took a shaky breath and said that several months earlier, when I was home, Claire had prepared my dinner herself. Lily had been sitting at the kitchen table drawing pictures when she saw Claire open a small bottle and pour something into my glass. Lily said she asked her mother what it was, but Claire became angry and told her never to ask questions about grown-up things. I felt my heart pounding as I remembered that evening. I had complained about feeling unusually dizzy after dinner, but Claire had told me I was simply tired from work. I asked Lily why she had never told me. She lowered her eyes and said, "Claire had threatened to make me disappear if she ever spoke about it." I slowly stood from the chair and walked toward the window, pressing my right hand against the glass while I tried to control my breathing. Then I turned back toward Lily and asked if she knew where that bottle was. She nodded. She said Claire kept it inside a locked cabinet in the kitchen. I immediately called the investigator and told him everything Lily had just revealed. Within minutes, he arrived at the hospital with another officer. I explained what Lily had told me, and they began documenting every detail. Then the investigator asked Lily one final question. "Do you know why your mother was putting something in your father's food?" Lily hesitated, squeezed my hand, and whispered, "Because Mommy said Daddy had to become sick before she could get his money." My stomach dropped. The investigator looked at me, then quietly said, "Daniel, This is no longer just a child abuse investigation. We may be looking at an attempted poisoning. I sat beside Lily for a few seconds, staring at the floor while the investigator's words sank in. Attempted poisoning. The phrase felt impossible to connect with the woman I had married. I slowly stood up, pushed my chair back with my right hand, and walked toward the hallway with the investigator. I told him I wanted to return home immediately, but he stopped me and said we needed to secure the house first. A team was sent to our home, and I went with them. When we arrived, I stepped out of the car, closed the door behind me, and looked at the house I had always considered the safest place for my family. That feeling was gone. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside while the investigators followed closely behind. We walked into the kitchen, and I pointed toward the cabinet Lily had described. One investigator put on gloves, opened the cabinet, and found a small bottle hidden behind several containers. I watched him carefully remove it and place it inside an evidence bag. Then another investigator opened the refrigerator and began checking everything Claire had prepared recently. I stood beside the kitchen counter with both hands resting on its edge, trying to remember every meal Claire had made during the past several months. Suddenly, I remembered the dizziness I had experienced after dinner on 3 separate occasions. I had always assumed I was exhausted. Now I wondered if those moments had been warnings I had ignored. The investigator then walked toward the dining room and stopped beside a drawer. He pulled it open and found several medical documents belonging to me. Some were copies of my insurance information, while others contained details about my savings and life insurance policy. My hands tightened into fists. Claire had not only been hurting Lily, she had apparently been studying my finances. Then the investigator found something even more disturbing. A printed document showing the estimated value of my life insurance policy. I stared at the number and felt a deep chill. It was far more than I had ever told Claire about. The investigator looked at me and said, "Daniel, I think we now understand why your wife wanted you to become sick." Before I could respond, his phone rang. He listened for a few seconds, then looked directly at me. "The lab just confirmed the substance in that bottle is dangerous." The investigator's words left me standing completely still in the kitchen. I slowly lowered my eyes to the evidence bag in his hand, then looked toward the cabinet where the bottle had been hidden. For several seconds, I could not accept what I was hearing. I had spent decades believing that my wife was the person I could trust most. Yet she had apparently been planning something that could have taken my life. I asked the investigator what would happen next, and he told me that the laboratory would complete a full analysis while the police secured the house as a crime scene. I nodded and stepped backward, placing my right hand against the kitchen counter because my legs suddenly felt weak. Then I remembered Lily's frightened face in the hospital. She had been carrying the secret alone for months. I pulled out my phone and called the hospital to check on her. A nurse told me Lily was awake and stable, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. The investigators continued searching the house, and one of them called me into the bedroom. He was standing beside Claire's dresser holding a folder. I walked over slowly and took the folder from him. Inside were copies of my life insurance documents, bank statements, property records, and a handwritten list of everything Claire would receive if I died. My fingers tightened around the papers. Then I noticed one date written at the top of the list. It was dated 3 months before the first time I became sick after dinner. That meant this had not been an accident or a sudden decision. Claire had been preparing for my death long before I knew anything was wrong. I looked at the investigator and asked, "Where's my wife now?" He told me Claire had been taken to the station for questioning after officers found her near the hospital. I immediately asked if I could speak to her. The investigator warned me not to confront her alone, but I insisted that I needed to hear her explanation. Later that evening, I sat across from Claire in a small interview room. She avoided my eyes at first. I placed my hands flat on the table and asked why. She finally looked up at me and tears appeared in her eyes. But instead of denying everything, she whispered something that made my heart break all over again. "Daniel, I never meant for Lily to get hurt. She was only supposed to stay quiet." I sat across from Claire and stared at her, trying to understand how the woman I had loved for decades could say those words so calmly. I slowly pulled my chair closer to the table and placed both hands in front of me. "What were you trying to make her hide?" I asked. Claire lowered her head and began crying. For the first time, she admitted that Lily had discovered the truth about the money and the life Insurance policy. Claire had been planning to take control of my finances and property, and she believed that if I became seriously ill, she could eventually collect the insurance money and gain access to everything I owned. But Lily had seen too much and threatened to tell me. That was why Claire had frightened her, isolated her, and eventually hurt her badly enough to leave her unconscious. I listened without interrupting, even though every word felt like another piece of my life being destroyed. When she finally finished, I stood up slowly, pushed the chair back with my right hand, and walked toward the door. Before I left, I turned around and looked at her one last time. "You did not just betray me," I said quietly. "You taught our daughter to be afraid of the people who were supposed to protect her." Claire began sobbing, but I did not turn back. Lily recovered slowly over the following weeks, and every day I sat beside her, held her hand, and reminded her that she was safe. The investigation uncovered the financial documents, the dangerous substance, the recordings, and the evidence of repeated abuse. Claire was eventually charged, and I began the difficult process of rebuilding my daughter's sense of safety. I also realized that I could not change what had happened, but I could make sure Lily never felt alone again. Months later, she asked me if I was angry with her because she had not told me sooner. I knelt beside her, held her face gently between my hands, and told her, "You never had to protect Daddy. Daddy was supposed to protect you." She hugged me tightly, and for the first time since that terrible afternoon, I felt that my little girl was beginning to heal. I came home early that day expecting to surprise my family. Instead, I discovered a truth that changed everything. My wife had tried to hide what was happening, but my daughter's courage finally brought the truth into the light, and I learned something I will carry for the rest of my life. Sometimes the smallest voice in the house is the one brave enough to tell the truth when everyone else is afraid.